And time now for my After Five guest on the programme. I'm delighted he joined me. He's the author of a book called The Jews in Wales. He said good afternoon to Kai Parry Jones.
Hi there.
How are you, okay?
Yeah, very good, thanks. Yourself?
I'm fine, yeah, thank you. Kai, you studied and researched the Jewish population for this book. Why were they always saying that the Jews are always on the move before World War II?
Well, there was a lot of persecution going on in Eastern Europe, and particularly in what was known as Russia. It's not the Russia we know today, but areas of Eastern Europe where there were lots of pogroms and economic anti-Semitism. And, this is in line with the time when lots of migrants were moving over to America as well. And Jews formed a large proportion of that migration, escaping persecution, seeking a better life. And as well as coming to America, a lot of them, ended up in South Wales and other parts of Wales and other parts of the United Kingdom.
That's right. When the first Jews were found in Swansea in 1740, was it work that drew them?
Yes, primarily. And the first community was in Swansea, set up in 1768. That's the official establishment date for the community. But yes, it was primarily at that time would have been employment opportunities. So Swansea developing as a copper town. They wouldn't necessarily have worked in primary industry with skill at the time. Jews that lived in Swansea came from Central Europe, and at the time, they would have worked in retail, worked as tailors, watchmakers, that sort of thing. So with the rise of Swansea came the need for these kind of facilities, and Jews saw an economic niche there to fill those facilities for the working class population.
We've heard that there was a Jewish ghetto in Venice, which would mean a lot of moneylenders in that area. Was that possible in Swansea?
Well, you have in South Wales, and you had a lot of Jews, particularly during the early 20th century, that went into the pawnbroking industry.
Right.
And that's not really reflected throughout the UK. And it's interesting because obviously South Wales having quite a large working class population at the time, pawnbroker was known as the working class's bankman. So again, there was this niche that was occurring in South Wales at the time, and with financial backgrounds, especially in retail and in banking in certain parts of Germany and in Eastern Europe. It was an opportunity to continue with that mode of work.
We find the first synagogue in Wine Street in Swansea. Was it a purpose-built area, or was it something that had been taken over?
No, so the first synagogue in Wine Street was in the house of what a lot of people say was the first Jewish person in Swansea. He was very influential in setting up the community, and his name was David Michael. And the first synagogue was set up in his back room, in his living room, because at the time the community was so small that there weren't enough people around to warrant a purpose-built synagogue. So the first purpose-built synagogue opened in Waterloo Street in the late 1820s.
Yeah.
And then the community, this was a very small synagogue. It was set off from the road. It wasn't on the main road. And there's a description of it being down an alleyway. And over time, the community grew and grew and grew. And they set themselves up on Goat Street, and they built themselves a very fantastic, neoclassical style synagogue, which mirrored a lot of the neoclassical chapels that were built on that road.
So they were responsible for building them and funding them then in later days, were they?
Yes, they were self-funded. They were funded either by influential members of the community, or if you look at the Jewish Chronicle, for instance, you will see that lots of Jews from other parts of the UK and across the world would also help fund these synagogues. So it was all driven by the Jewish community itself. So
the synagogue in Christina Street in Swansea, is that sort of later on, much later on?
Yes, so that came later on. I'm not sure if you're familiar with it, but it's a post-war building.
I do know it. Yeah.
In style. It's quite a complicated history, but essentially what happened in the late 19th century was that you had a established community in Swansea, been there for 100 years, and over time that community kind of anglicised itself. They became British, or Welshicized, you could say that as well, but they became British, and that they weren't as German as they were before. So this period of kind of integration, assimilation was going on. And in the late 19th century, you then had a big wave of Jewish migrants coming from Eastern Europe, again, from what I said before, escaping pogroms and seeking new economic opportunities and a better life elsewhere. And there was a real clash between these two communities, because the community that had been there for over 100 years, they became quite a middle-class community. And the immigrants that came over in the late 19th century, they were more impoverished and working-class community. So there were class tensions between these communities, but also different styles of worship that it clashed. They came from different parts of Europe. They had their own styles of worship, own form of Judaism. So there was a real clash there on religious grounds as well. So the group of migrants that came in the 19th century, the poorer migrants, set up their own synagogue in what is now known as Prince of Wales Road in Swansea.
Right.
So they set up a synagogue there, which opened in 1907. And eventually what had happened was, during the Second World War, the Goat Street Synagogue, which was the synagogue that I mentioned previous to the synagogue I'm talking about now, that had actually been bombed during the Blitz in 1941. So the older Jewish community in Swansea didn't have a synagogue after Second World War, and the Prince of Wales Road Synagogue, which was the newer migrant synagogue, it got to a point where the community was so small that they just thought it was absolutely... And, over time, these migrants that came in the late 19th century began to integrate and assimilate a bit more, and were again beginning to climb the economic ladder. So the community was starting to become a bit more harmonious than it used to be. And they decided to amalgamate. So the Prince of Road Synagogue closed in the 1950s. And then the Fenoni Road Synagogue, which is the post-war synagogue that still exists in Swansea now, was built and opened in 1955. So that has been the synagogue of the community since 1955. But over time, the community has declined significantly. So, in the early 1900s, you're talking about 1,000 Jewish people in Swansea. In the mid-20th century, you're talking about 500 people. And now, you can probably say that there are less than 20 Jewish people in Swansea. So the Fenoni Road Synagogue is too big to accommodate the community that still exists. So they sold that synagogue in 2009 to a Christian denomination, and they still have use of a side room, which they do use as a synagogue, and to this day they still use that as a smaller synagogue.
Right, very, very interesting. So this kind of class distinction, in a way, has affected the occupations. So you might have somebody working in the copperworks, also somebody working in a shop as well. Is it that sort of thing?
Yes, absolutely. There aren't many examples. There were certainly, I haven't come across any Jewish workers in the copperworks, but I've definitely found examples of Jewish miners and Jewish steel workers. So class distinction was definitely a thing. They were definitely not homogenous when it came to class. They reflected wider non-Jewish society, certainly. Is an interesting point, because I think a lot of people, they have their stereotypes and things like that. They don't kind of understand that there are these class distinctions.
Yeah. We've covered people came from Russia between 1881 and 1914 because of persecution. We can't mention the Jews without actually mentioning the World War II, where saw children coming via the kinder transport to Swansea.
Yes, there certainly are examples of children who came over from Germany on the kinder transport who would eventually have ended up in Swansea. They were scattered all over the place, and the experiences, which is something I talk about a lot in my book, but the experiences of these kinder transport children were so varied. But in Swansea, there's a great book called Parry's Children, which was written, a memoir written by a kinder transportee who settled in Swansea, and she talks about, the difficulties that she had with the Jewish family that she lived there, and, these experiences were varied, and, the community itself had raised money to bring, refugee children over from the camps that were set up, in Dover and in the southeast of England when the kinder transportee children came over, and they raised enough funds for them to come and live in Swansea with them for a period. So the experiences were very varied.
There's some lovely stories in them, and the Reverend Joseph Weintraub of Swansea took 12 boys from a Jewish camp in February 1939. Exactly.
That's the example I was referring to, yes.
Yeah, and he spent time with the Christian family, yes, is that right, yeah?
Yes, absolutely.
And then there was another beautiful story, which is, I think it's Erwin Kirschenbaum, who fostered by Reverend Rosalind and received his bar mitzvah in Swansea. Tremendous, again, wonderful care and attention to the Jewish people who were coming into the country during World War II.
Yes, absolutely.
Now you're saying that the decline is there. There's only 20 people of Jewish faith left in Swansea. Moving away, mixed marriages, that sort of thing. Does a lot of that go on as well?
Yes, it did. So it's very complicated in terms of the reasons behind the decline. But the trouble is with any of the Jewish communities in Wales, there were several, more than 30 at one point. And the trouble was that they were all so small, and they never really, the largest was in Cardiff, which, at its peak was no larger than about 3,500 Jewish people.
Right.
Which may sound like a lot, but then when you compare it to places like London, Manchester, and Liverpool, and Leeds, and Glasgow, it's very, very small. So one of the main factors was the fact that a lot of people who grew up Jewish in these towns, they wanted a better Jewish infrastructure. They wanted Jewish schools, they wanted their kosher butchers on hand.
Yeah.
They wanted to be Jewish 24/7. And unfortunately, there were struggles in these communities. Kosher butchers and things like that came in waves, essentially. They weren't always there. So, occasionally you'd have to rely on, trains coming in from London to bring in kosher food and things like that.
Right.
So the desire for a greater Jewish infrastructure in places like London and Manchester was definitely something that led to Jews leaving places like Swansea. But also, as you said, some Jews married out, but and within Orthodoxy weren't welcomed back into the community because it was seen as almost as being a traitor in a way. And the other examples are, because it was such a small community, there weren't enough Jews to partner up with. So, parents traditionally would send their children off to the larger communities, and they would partner up with other Jews there, and they wouldn't come back.
The book is full of some wonderful research. Has it taken you a while to write the book?
Yes, it did. So I started in 2010. I did a PhD for 4 years at Bangor University. So I finished that in March 2014, and then until June last year, I turned my thesis into what is the book now. It's definitely been part of my life for a while, almost a decade, a good 7 years.
Well, thanks so much for being my After Five guest today. I was really intrigued by the information in the book, and thank you for producing that for us.
No, it's a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.